Great, thank you. We are delighted to be joined by Paul Heslop from the UN Mine Action Service, who is currently the UN Mine Action Service advisor to our country team in Ukraine. So Paul, you have the floor, and then we'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. I think just to start off, I've got a few slides. I will go through them very quickly because they're more of a reminder for me and just to maybe highlight the odd point. But the first thing I would say is, why are mines or unexploded ordnance in Ukraine important and relevant? Well, every person in this room, every person in this city, every person in this country, and every person on this planet is paying more for their food and more for their energy because of the conflict in Ukraine. And the ability to get land back into use that will bring down those prices is dependent on the actual presence of mines and other unexploded devices and the actual presence. So you've got the presence and the perceived presence. And actually probably for every actual mine or for every square meter that is contaminated, you've probably got in excess of 100 square meters that isn't. So for us to change the way we work in Ukraine and to make ourselves more effective is key. But by doing that and making it work properly, we will affect every person on this planet by bringing down the price of food and global food security and hopefully making the world a slightly better place. So what is the problem? 20% of the country is suspected of having some level of contamination. What that actual amount is hard to say, but over 6 million people now live near hazardous areas. There have been over 812 incidents recorded since the full-blown invasion, and we're seeing, probably the most significant problem for mines and UXO certainly in Europe since the Second World War. Just a few other numbers. 2 years ago, the number was 174,000 square kilometers of land was suspected. Today, that's down to 139,000. Why? Because the Ukrainians have been very adept at using new technologies, interrogating satellite imagery, drone imagery, different sources of data, applying AI to it, and releasing assessing that over 30,000 square kilometers of land that may have been contaminated actually wasn't contaminated and could be used and could be returned for agricultural production. That is the equivalent of 20 times the current problem in Afghanistan. So that was done for cents on the square meter or fractions of cents on the square meter by adopting new technology and thinking in a new way to solve or to look at solutions for this problem, how we address the perception of contamination. What is demining in Ukraine? And I think this is one of the problems that a lot of people struggle with. So the analogy I'm using here is the 5 blind men and the elephant. One guy's touching the trunk and he thinks it's a rope. Another guy's touching the tail and he thinks it's a snake. Somebody's touching the leg, he thinks it's a column. Somebody's touching the side, it's a wall. Demining is a bit like that. Everybody gets a bit obsessed with, is it humanitarian demining? Is it economic demining? Is it military demining? Well, in reality, it's an explosive hazard that needs to be removed to allow the country to rebuild and for reconstruction. So what do we need to do? We need to step back, look at the problem. It's an elephant. It's not a wall or a rope or a snake. And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So I think we just need to keep pressing on and working on this problem. Contaminated land is not just dangerous, it's lost hope, recovery and livelihood. Again, just an example of where things have gone well. A year ago, you can see all of those red dots are areas that were suspected of being contaminated, and that land was being denied use, particularly for farming. Today, you can see, sorry, let me just get rid of this. That through the use of innovative technologies, a lot of that land has now been assessed as being usable. So, so we're seeing real progress. And again, although it would be nice to clear every single mine in Ukraine or every single unexploded item in Ukraine, it's probably not going to be possible to do that quickly. But if we can remove the areas that have potential contamination, the areas that can be returned quickly and safely, the land that has high economic value or is critical infrastructure, allows energy supplies to be re-established, allow roads to be opened, then clearly, we can get a much bigger bang for our buck, so to speak. Again, some of the successes from the Ukrainian government side, 23 government agencies are now, 23 government entities are now accredited to conduct demining operations, and there's a lot of very brave men and women, Ukrainian men and women who are going out every day and clearing thousands of items. As I say, 35,000 square kilometers of land that was suspected a year ago is no longer. and we're now having, and we've now seen an increase in demining machines from under 10 2 years ago to nearly 200. And I think by the end of this month we will cross the 200 mark. We have a national strategy, new professional standards for deminers, streamlining certification, better mechanized demining, a tender system so that the funds the Ukrainian government are bringing into the equation are being used in the most effective way possible, and improved standards and access to techniques such as land release and risk management, as I mentioned. What are we trying to do? The thing is, demining or mine clearance is an inherently inefficient process. I've cleared thousands of mines, I've worked in many countries, but if I could have just spent the time clearing the land that had the mine in it, I would have been a lot more efficient. Unfortunately, I've probably spent 95% of my time or more clearing land that doesn't have mines in it, because you don't know exactly where the mines are. So one of the things that we're trying to do is use the different techniques and the different technologies that are available, each of which get progressively more assured, but also more expensive. So what I've got here at the top is using, as I say, satellite imagery or drone imagery down to the bottom, where you have a manual deminer sweeping with his detector or prodding with a bayonet, and you know that he's going to clear 100% of everything to 100% accuracy. But he's going to be, or she is going to be, very expensive. So what we're developing in Ukraine is what I'm saying, describing as an efficiency curve, where each of these techniques that get slightly more and more effective, but slightly more expensive, so that at the end of the problem, we're going to do it as cost effectively as possible. Because one of the challenges is the scale of the problem in Ukraine is so big, it is going to be billions of dollars. Now the question is it going to be single-digit billions of dollars, or is it going to be tens or hundreds of billions of dollars? Ukraine already has, quite a problem with debt, and there's an awful lot of recovery will be needed. So everything we can do that makes demining and mine clearance and bomb disposal in Ukraine more efficient will ultimately, when the grant money stops, save Ukraine from having to borrow funds unnecessarily, which will mean that money can be spent on building hospitals and schools and creating employment, and not on clearing land that doesn't have any contamination in it. So, trying to adopt this efficiency curve, I think, is quite key to, the economic future of Ukraine and the cost to the donors of mine action. I won't go into the details of this, but this is the project life cycle of where we try to get agricultural land back as quickly and as efficiently as possible. Ultimately, the crux of the problem: how do we solve a humanitarian and economic problem created by mines and UXO in an environment where traditional donor funding is decreasing without creating crippling or unnecessary national debt for this and current and future generations of Ukraine? And a lot of time has been spent on trying to sort this out. Some of the challenges: there is massive contamination, real and perceived. Incomplete data, we need to do more survey. There are duplicating and conflicting systems. We're still we're still in a war situation. Shortage of human capacity. A lot of the people are either on the front line or have left the country. We're trying to adapt between national standards and international norms and best practices. We have some issues with coordination. We need more quality assurance and M&E. Significant funding gaps. New technology is great, but how do you test it? How do you prove it? How do you evaluate it? How do you increase it and work at scale? And then a lot of donor fragmentation, duplication, and coherence. The donor community has been fantastic in Ukraine for mine action. Over $1 billion of funds pledged so far. Huge amounts of resources made, but there has definitely been duplication, and there is a need for better cohesion and coherence in that area. Some of the strategic priorities for the UN for us to work on: how do we implement the country's national strategy? How do we increase logistics support? How do we have better strategic and technical planning? Innovation and scalability. Scalability is key. Again, we're not talking about 1 or 10 or 100 minefields here. We're talking about thousands of areas that need to be assessed, or tens of thousands of areas that need to be assessed, and thousands of areas that will need to be cleared. We've got a front line that is 1,000 kilometers long, 5 to 20 kilometers deep. That has some of the worst contamination we've seen probably in history, certainly the worst since the Second World War, and that's going to require an awful lot of effort and resources to address it. without reading long lists. So basically, there are lots of challenges and lots of priorities for us to work on. Some great innovation taking place, and for me, this is one of the exciting things about being in Ukraine at the moment. We're seeing new sensors being developed or combining old sensors, use of things like LiDAR, ultraviolet radiation, infrared, GPR, magnetic, nuclear, and where you hit the ground with energy and you can detect what's under it from the way that responds. You can fly a drone just before sunset in some areas, taking images with an infrared camera, fly back. Half an hour later, when the sun's gone down, there's a temperature gradient between the mine and the ground, and the mine is visible. So there's all sorts of different uses of technology that we can do there. Lots of use of drones in the land, on the sea, in the air. Adoption of AI into different things. I mean, we're looking at hopefully being able to have, even if a tiny fragment or a piece of the mine or the UXO is visible, with a high-resolution camera and an AI attached to it, you would be able to see that. You'd be able to tell from the shape of the craters, the dispensation of the craters, again, the type of weapon systems that have been used, likely failure rates. So there's huge potential for crunching all of this data using AI. Good levels of data integration. Ukraine is a very digitized society. Everything is done on QR codes and Apple Pay, so it's it's a very digital and tech-savvy society. Lots of layers of data that can be integrated. So one of the things we were looking at is looking at cell phone data to see if people have been going up and down roads, and if they haven't been going up and down roads, maybe that road is contaminated. Or if we're trying to send survey teams out, identifying the number of people who live in an area, and are there a lot of returns, a lot of IDPs or refugees gone back to that area, and so that we can target the resources that we need to be there to make it as safe as quickly as possible. So integrating different levels of technology, different levels of data, and non-traditional sources of data to try and make sure our programs are as effective as possible. And then one of the other things now with the development of certainly digital GPS and the imaging is the ability to, once we've done at least 3 flights over an area, as long as it's in 2 directions and at 2 different altitudes, we can start 3D mapping the areas, which again lets us to virtually create the minefield or the contaminated area and come up with a more effective plan on how to deal with that and address it. And these are all things that I'd never seen before, and are really innovating in Ukraine very quickly now. And we're looking at ways to improve the quality management, the quality assurance, and again, the cost efficiency of the programs, again, using remote sensors and new technologies. Had some good successes in the last 12 months. Again, I won't go through it. If anybody wants this presentation, happy to share it afterwards. What we need to do is make sure the investment that's been made to date, as I say, $1 billion has been committed already. Unfortunately, we will need several billion more. But how do we ensure that what's being invested continues to deliver results, and how we enhance those and work better moving forward? A lot of risk education and looking at different ways of communicating, segmenting the data, and then possibly what I think is one of the most significant initiatives is how do we address gender stereotypes. Over 50% of the population in the Ukraine are women. A lot of women have never worked in the mine action sector before. It's perceived to be too dangerous. It's a man's job. You've got to be ex-military, and in reality, we've got probably 10 or 15% of the workforce already are women. Great team leaders, inspirational characters working in very non-traditional roles and delivering fantastic results. How do we turn this round and bring more women into the sector? And when we actually analyse it, it turns out it's not just the women's aversion to it because they think it's dangerous, but it can often be the father or the husband who doesn't think that's a woman's work. So we're working with UN Women and working with other civil society entities to sort of challenge these gender stereotypes and these gender norms, and trying to bring more women into the sector, particularly those whose they're either displaced, they're a war widow, or their husbands have been injured, and maybe having a good dollar-based income every month is something that is good for their family. So looking at those things. The other thing I'll finish with is it's difficult to understand the scale of the problem because Ukraine is so big. But if I do sort of simple number, the war's been going on for about 1,200 days. If we say 10,000 rounds were fired a day, which is not that many, when the numbers actually reported are 4 or 5 times that on some days, that's 12 million rounds of ammunition have been fired. If we have a 10% fail rate, that's 1.2 million unexploded bombs. Some of the ammunition that's been used is very old and has been stored for a very long time. So we're hearing of up to 40% fail rate. So if we say a base figure of 10%, that's 1.2 million items. But if you say 40% fail rate, suddenly we're at 5 million items. And if you say you fired just twice as much as I've said, which is a low estimate, you're at 10 million unexploded bombs in Ukraine in the last 3 years. You know, that is going to be a lot of work, and it's going to need to be resourced, and we're going to need to address it. We know how to do it. We've done it in many, many other countries, but we need the resources to do it, and it's going to be a slow and potentially dangerous process. But if we get it right, we will bring down global food and energy prices. We will be able to return land to let people return to their homes safely, and we'll get one of the economies, you know, of the Ukrainian economy back on its feet. Thank you very much. Very happy to take any questions.
Right. Edie?
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of follow-up questions. First, are there any figures on exactly how food prices have been affected? And secondly, what is your assessment of who's responsible for this unexploded ordnance and mine planting itself? And third, do you have the latest casualty figures from mine people stepping on mines and it during in and out of mine clearance operations? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For the first one, the figures on the food prices, I don't. I'm sure that FAO or WFP would probably have that. I'm sure FAO do. But I mean, again, even if we were talking about 1 cent per loaf of bread difference in price, when you consider how many loaves of bread have been sold in the last 1,200 days, we're talking about a lot of money has been spent because of the increase in price. And I think it was probably more than 1 cent per loaf of bread. The same if you said it was 1 cent per litre of fuel. I don't know the numbers. I'm sure one of the food organisations could say that. But certainly if you look at the historic trends of global food prices since February 2022, you know, they're higher now than they were before. Who's responsible? Well, I mean, as always in conflict, if there was no conflict, there'd be no unexploded bombs and no mines. So I guess you could say the responsibility lies with the two sides that are firing weapons at each other. The cause of the conflict I won't go into, and who has fired more than the other. I think people can work that out. But yeah, I mean, what I would say though is, and this has always surprised me, is if iPhones or refrigerators or cars were built to a standard where 10 to 40% failing was an acceptable rate, I don't think we would see a lot of, you know, I don't think the Apple share price would be what it is, or Toyota's share price would be what it is. You know, if 1 in 10 people who drove out of the Toyota showroom got 2 miles down the road before their car broke down, they probably wouldn't be too pleased. So it is I've always found it slightly staggering that weapons manufacturers, and I'm not saying whether you should or shouldn't use weapons here, but assuming the weapons are being used in accordance of the rules of the conflict and go off when they're meant to against a military target, then I'm amazed at the poor quality control that is allowed there. The fact that they don't go off when they're meant to, and years later a civilian can come trundling along, often a child, and either pick the item up or hit it or try and put it on a fire or move it, and then they get killed or maimed because of that, because of the poor quality control of weapon systems that are sold around the world. You know, I do think if I was spending that sort of money on a product, I'd expect it to work a bit better than it does. And you know, some of the munitions we're seeing coming from North Korea have a 40% plus fail rate. You know, they're old and they've been stored for a long time badly, and then they've been fired, probably by troops who weren't trained to use that equipment properly, and so you have a very high fail rate. But I mean, even in weapon systems that I've seen in Afghanistan and the Balkans and around the world, it's always amazed me at the rate of failure for systems that are very, very expensive. And the casualty figures, sorry, the number I had at the start was 812, I think. I don't know at all how many military have been killed or injured through mines. Those are the civilian numbers, and they don't include what's in the occupied territories. So I would say that number is a very low estimate, I'm afraid, but I have no accurate figures, because once you go within 20 kilometres of the front line, the buffer zone, everything becomes very classified.
Okay, Frank?
Yes, Frank is here. I wanted to follow up on Edie's question. She was asking who put the mines in the ground. You've been doing this for, what, 30 years?
Yep.
Okay, so you've probably seen every type of mine, I suppose?
I've seen a few.
Right, okay. Who is the maker of the mines you've been taking out of the ground?
Well, I think
Which countries are they coming from?
I think this is one of the great successes of the Ottawa Treaty, is that, you know, millions and millions of mines have been that were previously stockpiled have been destroyed, and the number of mines laid in the last 30 years, with the exception of a couple of notable conflicts, has been significantly reduced. Now, if you go to sort of the reference manual for the sector, which is Jane's Mines, I think there's about 650 mines types listed in that book, so somewhere between 600 and 700. But the vast majority of what we're finding in Ukraine are former Soviet era mines, particularly PFM1s, PMNs, PMN2s, POMs, OZM bounding mines, the TM, the anti-tank mines, anti-vehicle mines. There are also newer Russian mines that have been deployed, and there are improvised mines. I'm not sure I'd call them IEDs as such, but they're being printed on 3D printers and manufactured locally. Now, around the world, I mean, the vast majority of mines that I've cleared were former Soviet Union, or former Warsaw Pact, sorry, and Chinese. In southern Africa, quite a lot of South African mines, but also in some of the other colonial areas. You know, I've come across Belgium and Portuguese mines. So, you know, but those countries have not manufactured those mines since they signed the treaty or exported them. But that's one of the problems of mines, is, you know, they're often plastic, they're watertight, if they've been stored correctly, they're absolutely fine to use 20, 30 years after manufacture. If they've been deployed, and they've been deployed correctly, normally they're hermetically sealed, and as long as they're not exposed to sunlight, water doesn't really bother them. So quite often it's only if you see something that's actually going to degrade the plastic, which would be UV exposure or changing heat, you know, hot and cold. Now these mines do degrade and some of the detonators start to fail, but to be honest, if after 50 years you said 50% of them don't work, and after 60 years 80% of them don't work, if there was 1,000 laid, you still got, you know, a significant number of mines out there that would take your leg off. So I mean, that's one of the problems, is, you know, when you see a mine in the ground, even if it doesn't work, you've got to assume it does.
Have you come across any mines in Ukraine that you've discovered were made in the United States?
I have not heard of any reports of any US mines being used in Ukraine as of yet.
I don't see any other questions. Are there any questions online? If not, I'd like once more to thank our guest. Paul Heslop. Thanks very much for your detailed briefing, and thanks, and thank you all. Have a good afternoon, and a reminder that there will be no briefing tomorrow for the Eid holiday, but we'll be back on Monday. Have a good weekend.